Welcome to another episode of the Pennsylvania Historical Markers series. Today we're doing a video on General Edward Braddock of the British Army, who was the head of the armies for the British and the American troops against the French and the Indians in the French and Indian War. This is actually a viewer-submitted video submitted by Angela and she runs the YouTube channel A Trail to the Past, so check her out. And I'll put the links up and all that. General Edward Braddock was buried here in 1755 after his disastrous defeat and death. The site of his original grave, the new grave to which his remains were moved in 1804, and a trace of the Braddock Road may be seen here. It's a little confusing the way that's written, but this is in the place basically where he died, and we'll go into later with some more pictures from Angela that talk about where the monument is, where he was originally buried, the reason why they buried him there, and some of the unique things that have to do with that. So let's continue the video and talk a little bit more in depth about Major General Edward Braddock. Major General Edward Braddock, he was born in January 1695 and lived to the 13th of July 1755, and that's important as we talk about this ill-fated Braddock expedition, which ultimately led to his death. He was a British officer and commander-in-chief for the 13 colonies during the start of the French and Indian War, which lasted 1754 to 1763. It was also known as the North American front of what is known in Europe and Canada as the 7 Years' War, which they have from 1756 to 1763. Part of the reason for that is sort of from 54 through 56, that was probably more when the attacks began by the Native Americans, and just sort of what led and precipitated eventually to the French allying themselves with the Native American tribes that chose to fight against the British. He's generally best remembered for his command of the disastrous expedition against the French occupied Ohio River Valley in 1755, in which he was killed. So let's go into his life. He was born in 1695 as the son of Major General Edward Braddock of the Coldstream Guards and his wife. Braddock followed his father into the British Army, and at age 15 he was appointed ensign in his father's regiment on the 11th of October 1710. Eventually he was promoted to lieutenant of the Grenadier Company in 1716. Once again was promoted to captain in 1736 at the age of 41. He then made major in 1743 and was promoted lieutenant colonel of the regiment on the 21st of November 1745. In 1747 he participated in the siege of Bergen-op-Zoom, and on February 17th of 1753, Braddock was appointed colonel of the 14th Regiment of Foot, and in the following year he became Major General. Now, appointed shortly afterward to command against the French in America, Braddock landed with 2 regiments of British regulars in February of 1755 in Hampton, Virginia. He went on meeting with several of the colonial governors at the Congress of Alexandria on the 14th of April. And he was persuaded to undertake vigorous actions against the French. This attack that they came up with would proceed on 4 fronts. they had a general from Massachusetts who would attack at Fort Niagara. Now, Fort Niagara is right along Lake Ontario, right there near Niagara Falls. It's actually a really neat place. I'd like to take you guys sometime. But at that time, the French owned that and occupied that. The second attack on the front would be General William Johnson, who would attack Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point. And third, Colonel Robert Monckton at Fort Beausejour, I believe is how it's pronounced. It's probably a little off, on the Bay of Fundy, while Braddock himself would lead an expedition against Fort Decoy, I'm sorry, it's now Pittsburgh, at the forks of the Ohio River. They had several months of preparation, which really was caused a lot of problems by administrative confusion and sort of the resources that they had been promised by the colonials just weren't coming in. So unfortunately, if he had maybe started sooner, it might have ended differently, but they just, from the very beginning, they were plagued with issues. George Washington actually served as a volunteer officer, I think it was as a colonel, in these regiments. Now, Braddock, where he made his first mistake is, and just shows sort of how he didn't have a whole lot of respect for the enemy, he wound up taking some of his men, marched forward, but left most of his men behind. The column crossed the Monongahela River on the 9th of July, 1755, and shortly afterward, they wound up colliding head-on with the French and Indian force coming from Fort Decoy. They were trying to oppose the river crossing. Although the initial exchange favored the British, they actually killed the French commander and caused a number of the Canadian militia to flee. The remaining Indian and French force reacted quickly. They went down the flanks of the column and put it under a murderous crossfire. Now, they didn't react very well, the British troops, and became disordered. The British attempted retreat, but ran into the rest of the British soldiers earlier left behind. Now, Braddock rallied his men repeatedly, but at last he fell mortally wounded with a shot through the chest. Although the exact causes of the defeat are debated to this day, one of the biggest contributing factors was likely his underestimation of how effectively the French and Indians could react in a battle situation, and how rapidly the discipline and fighting effectiveness of his own men could evaporate in this type of situation. They actually had an article in 1951 from the Roanoke Times that claims that Braddock was shot by an American soldier called Benjamin Bolling. According to the article, Bolling intentionally shot Braddock to protect the lives of his fellow American soldiers during the ambush, as British troops were firing at American troops under the mistaken impression that they were actually French troops due to the fact that many of the Americans had taken cover in a tree line. And this is sort of what we talked about in the video a couple times. The American troops fought a lot like the Native Americans. They learned off them to use the terrain, and that just wasn't the way the British fought, so they automatically assumed. It's sort of what makes this potentially plausible. Whether it's what actually happened or not, who knows. But the death of Braddock then allowed for Washington to take command and order a retreat. And that was something that Washington took quite a bit of flack for ordering a retreat, but they really had no chance. And overall, it allowed the Americans to fall back without being further fired upon by the confused British, saving many other lives. Now, Braddock was borne off the field by Washington and Colonel Nicholas Merriweather, and he died on the 13th of July from wounds suffered in the battle. Before he died, Braddock left Washington his ceremonial sash that he wore with his battle uniform, as well as his 2 pistols. And some of his last words were, "Who would have thought? And we shall know better another time." Reportedly, Washington always took this sash with him for the rest of his life, both as the commander of the Continental Army and for his presidential duties. It is still on display today at Washington's home at Mount Vernon. All right, so Major General Braddock was buried just west of Great Meadows, where the remnants of the column halted on its retreat to reorganize. He was buried in the middle of the road that his men had just cut through, and the wagons were rolled over top of the grave site to prevent his body from being discovered and desecrated by the Indians. George Washington presided at the burial service as the chaplain had been severely wounded. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography includes an account of helping General Braddock garner supplies and carriages for the general's troops. He also describes a conversation with Braddock in which he explicitly warned the general that his plan to march troops to the fort through a narrow valley would be dangerous because of the possibility of ambush. This is sometimes cited as advice against the disastrous eventual outcome, but the fact remains Braddock was not ambushed in that final action. The battle site was not, in any case, a narrow valley. He had actually taken great precautions against some kind of ambush and had crossed the Monongahela an additional time to avoid the narrow Turtle Creek defile. Now, in 1804, his remains, which they believed were Braddock's, were found buried in the roadway because, once again, the reason they did that is it was commonplace if a great officer, especially a commanding general, was buried, he would be dug up and they would defile the body. And because they didn't want that, that's the reason they did it. And then it was intelligent. Washington was like, then we'll run everything over this road to make it look like normal, so it was never found. But they did find much later when they decided to move it, and the remains were exhumed. A marble monument was erected over the new grave site in 1913 by the Coldstream Guards. Quite interesting. He actually is a bunch of namesake, like Braddock Borough, Mount Braddock, Braddock Hills, North Braddock in Pennsylvania, the community of Braddock Heights, number of other things that they have throughout, like Virginia, Maryland, and they also have Braddock's Road, which forms most of eastern U.S. Route 40 in Maryland and Pennsylvania. So he is well remembered, but unfortunately he has, as you research more and more, like, he wasn't a bad guy by any means. He just, his noble upbringing, the way the British Army really viewed any other army was, you know, and to their credit, they were the most powerful force on earth. They just sort of viewed the Native Americans and the Americans as just really pathetic forces, and they just didn't understand. They were used to the whole Napoleonic attack where you just sort of march across the fields and that type of stuff, and the warfare in America was very much different. You know, the Americans fought like the Native Americans, where they used the terrain to their advantage, and he just didn't get that. And really, his march on the Braddock's Road, it was obvious where they were at all times, and they were ripe for an ambush. And it was just, you know, Benjamin Franklin, even though he didn't get attacked in that narrow valley, Benjamin Franklin did try to warn him, like, this is not a good plan, it's going to end in disaster. And partially because Braddock didn't utilize his force the way he should have, he also put himself in that position and his men in that position that ultimately they would wind up being killed in this ambush and defeated. And, you know, it really was a disastrous defeat at that time. But thank you, as always, for coming along, and we can learn about this man together. And Cliff actually has quite a bit series on Braddock, and he's actually visited the site and everything. So I'll probably try to put up some of his video links for his YouTube channel, The Wandering Woodsman, and you guys can check those out if you want to. But thank you, as always, for coming along, and we will see you all about town. I also want to just mention thank you to Angela for sending this to me. Took a while to get to it, but it was cool researching him and talking about this man. So thank you, Angela, and Trail to the Past, and we'll see you all about town.